Say cheese.
Hey everybody, my name is Alex. I work here at Flyleaf Books. Thank you for coming out. Yeah, your support for our local independent bookstore really matters. So thank you for buying books and coming and filling seats. That lets us have these events. So tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from Melissa Faliveno for the launch of her debut novel, HEMLOCK, with Carter Sickels. Yeah. Melissa Faliveno is the author of the essay collection Tomboyland, named a best book of 2020 by NPR, New York Public Library, Oprah Magazine, and Electric Literature. The former senior editor of Poets and Writers magazine, Melissa is an assistant professor of creative writing at UNC Chapel Hill and lives in the woods outside Chapel Hill. Carter Sickels is the author of the novels The Prettiest Star and The Evening Hour. Carter is the 2024 recipient of Lambda's Literary's Duggan's Prize for Outstanding Mid-Career LGBTQ Novelists. He is an assistant professor of creative writing at NC State. Okay, thank you for coming. If you don't have a copy of HEMLOCK yet, or Tomboyland, or The Prettiest Star, we have those up front. So while supplies last. Now, right over to these two.
I think you should start. You're the reason we're here.
I guess I can do that. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for being here. This is such a kind of mind-blowing pleasure to look out into this crowd and see so many of you. I'm relatively new to Chapel Hill, and just to see this full room in this bookstore that I love really means a ton to me, and you've all helped make this feel like home, so thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Carter. Thank you, Flyleaf, for having us. Also, I don't know if anyone noticed, but the Flyleaf staff dressed in HEMLOCK colors today, which in terms of like making me feel very welcome and like home, like, ugh. So I dressed the same. We also didn't plan this. All of the rest of you who wore forest green or brown, thanks for showing up in this way. So I'm going to read a little bit from this book that came out today. This novel that I wrote, which is something I wasn't super planning on doing. I identify as an essayist first and foremost, but I ended up writing a novel. So apologies to my essayist friends. I have not left you. I will be back. But I'm going to read a little bit, and I thought because this is Pub Day and we are launching this book into the world that I would start with the first chapter. So I'm not going to tell you anything about it. I'm just going to place you in the eerie setting of this book. And then we'll talk a little bit, and then we're going to open it up for a conversation, and I want all of your questions. Nothing is off limits ever with me. Okay. Chapter 1. She arrived at the cabin at night. It wasn't late, but here in the woods in the springtime, in the far northern part of this far northern state, in this far northern country, the light left early and the dark stayed long. It was nearly pitch black as she drove the long gravel road that cut through the trees like she was taught, slowly, her eyes scanning ditch to ditch in a figure 8 for deer. She flipped on her high beams, the light cast out before her like a torch, but still had trouble seeing. She had forgotten how dark it got, this deep in the woods. She knew she was close. She could feel it by the narrowing of the road, by the trees bending in, the bright skeletons of birch curling across the path, their bare branches reaching like arms, stark white against a black curtain of pine. The car crawled down the rutted path, too low to the ground for this kind of terrain, tires crunching over downed branches and pine cones, gravel spraying its belly like buckshot. And then she saw it, like a beacon in the dark. The small metal sign on a low metal post, hammered long ago into the ground. Oh, I love this. The sound of it all reading along. A fire number blazed in white paint against red. No one in the woods had addresses or mailboxes, and there was no post office here. Mail could be sent to the grocery store in town, some 15 miles away, where an old woman behind the counter served as de facto postmistress. But most people rarely checked, and the mail piled up, the bills turning yellow to pink, the letters from home getting more frantic, and then less frequent, until the old woman behind the counter eventually threw everything away. For most people who found themselves here, and especially for those who stayed, part of the point was to disappear. The cabin was a small place, made of hand-laid pine, that sat far back from the road in a clearing, surrounded on all sides by deep forest. She turned down the gravel drive and watched it emerge before her, materializing like a ghost from the shadows. It was smaller than she remembered. In her dreams, where it turned up often, it was huge, a hulking, looming thing with endless doors and hallways, walls that seemed to breathe, a maze of passages that changed shape and stretched on forever, into nothing. In reality, it was a normal little house with 4 normal walls, a normal little porch and a chimney. It sat, unassuming, on a small slope of lawn, tucked safe inside that circle of trees. It almost looked inviting. She parked the car but kept the engine running, the headlights casting a strange yellow glow around the house. She sat for a moment, watching it, waiting for something but not knowing what. For a figure to appear in the window, a pale hand drawing back the curtain. For the building to take a great breath, its pine-board bones expanding, filling its cavernous lungs, then sighing back into the shape of a house. Ridiculous thoughts, but there they were, unbidden in her brain. And then came another, ringing bright and clear as if someone had said it aloud. There was still time to turn back, to leave this place, and never return. She shook the thought from her head, hopped out of the car and jogged to the shed, a large winter-faded outbuilding that served as garage, workshop, and storage unit some 50 feet from the cabin. She pulled on the heavy door, shouldering into it as it cracked up and then opened. Inside, the smell of rot. A squirrel or a mouse had probably crawled inside and died over the winter. Her stomach curled at the smell, sick and sweet. She pulled the string on a bare bulb that hung from the ceiling, but nothing happened. She squinted into the dark. At the back wall, she could make out the shape of a wood pile, a solid cord of maple and birch stacked high and neat, an axe leaning against it. The night was cold, and it would stay cold for a while, but with all this firewood, she'd be set, depending on how long she stayed. She scanned the shadows, spotted a small fishing boat with an outboard motor covered in a tarp, and beside it, what she'd most hoped to find, her father's Chevy S10, a late 80s model, cherry red and perfect. She opened the door, found the keys in the ignition, and turned. It sputtered for a second, then roared to life. She smiled. At least she wouldn't have to drive her tiny foreign car while she was here. Nothing would make her stand out more. She jogged back to the car and cut the engine, grabbed her bags, and stepped out into the night. The darkness was a solid thing, the silence loud. It rushed through her ears like wind, leaving a high-pitched ringing in its wake. She'd developed tinnitus in the city, but the constant din could usually be drowned out. Here, the sound was sharp. And beneath it, from out of the silence, came a symphony. Crickets and peepers and tree frogs singing into the night. She stood in a clearing, closed her eyes, and listened. She breathed deep, swallowing the cool night air. It tasted clean and sweet like water. She opened her eyes again. A sliver of moon peeked through the trees and cast a pale light, carving a path through the tall trees to the cabin. She followed it. Just this here. A fake rock on the porch housed a spare key, as it always had. She pried open the plastic by feel, fumbled to find the lock. She turned the key and pushed open the door, then stood on the threshold. A chill passed through her body. Like a goose walked over my grave, her grandmother used to say. She flipped the switch on the wall by the door, but no light came. Shit, she said aloud to no one. She'd forgotten about the breakers. She'd have to go to the basement to turn them on, bring the cabin back to life. She hoped the pipes hadn't frozen, as they often did when the place sat empty through winter. She'd forgotten about the problem of arriving at night, in the dark, after the place had been closed up for so long. She hadn't, it occurred to her then, thought at all about the implications of coming here like this, of being a woman alone in the woods. She hadn't considered being afraid. She stepped inside. The place smelled musty and strange, like it belonged to someone else. Beneath the dust and damp, that same sweet suggestion of rot, like something had lived and died in the walls. She left the door open, let a small slant of moonlight pour in. Her eyes began adjusting to the dark, and the place took shape before her. Not much had changed. It was a small space, a living room with a fireplace and a kitchen, a short hallway that led to 2 bedrooms and a bath, and a door that led to the basement. The furniture was the same old couch and rocking chair, same old kitchen table. It had all been in her parents' house once, in the town where she grew up, several hours south of here. The furniture had made its way to the cabin over the years, piece by piece, as her parents had pared down and planned eventually to retire. It was a plan, like so many, that never came to pass. She closed the door behind her. It clicked, and she was left again in darkness. She carried her bags down the hall, running her hand along the wall. She thought of the hallways in her dreams, then shook the thought away. She chose the bedroom that had once been hers, though her parents' room was bigger. She wouldn't be able to go in there yet, not for a while. She dropped her bags, then walked back down the hall. She stood outside the basement door, grabbed the knob, and turned. It was locked. People rarely locked their doors up here, so it was strange that this one should be. From the inside, no less, and from upstairs, as if to keep whatever was down there out. She turned the lock, her heart beating fast. She imagined an animal, a raccoon or possum, maybe even a mother bear and her cubs, having gotten in over the winter and living down there. It happened sometimes. She imagined yellow eyes in the dark, a growl and a hiss, claws and teeth. She imagined something far worse could be waiting. Among the things for which her home state was famous, beer, cheese, freezing games of football in the snow, was a long and storied tradition of serial killers. From those who made national news for eating their victims or making skin suits and furniture from their flesh, who terrorized entire generations only to be memorialized decades later in some bad true crime docuseries, to those who got far less publicity, who kidnapped women and took them to remote northern woods like these. Like one story, when she was a kid, about a college girl who'd been abducted after a night out and held captive in an abandoned cabin, much like this one, not far from here. By the time the girl's body was discovered, she'd been dead for weeks, and the man who killed her was never found. The story became, as such stories do, part of local lore, like Bigfoot and UFO sightings and the Paulding Light, a mysterious glowing orb that hovered above the train tracks just across the border. It became part of the mythology of the place, told around campfires in the summer. And that's what happens when girls go out alone, they'd say, flames casting shadows across grave faces. Girls who wear short skirts and drink too much and ask for trouble. And that man, that monster, is still up here somewhere, roaming the woods and waiting. When she was a girl, she'd been fascinated by these stories, with this gruesome history of her home state. It had all seemed so far away from her then, some safe distance that could never be crossed. But now, here she was, and she was alone, and it all felt much closer. She stood at the basement door and shivered, tried to stop her stupid brain from cycling through every horror it could summon. She fished her phone out of her pocket. The battery was in the red, but she flipped on the flashlight. She took a breath and opened the door. The stairs were steep, thin planks of pine with no risers that creaked under her feet as she stepped slowly down, a small circle of electric light illuminating each step and nothing more. She reached the cement floor and stopped, then jogged to the breaker box. She felt like a kid running to the cellar in her grandmother's farmhouse for a jar of pickles, heart slamming wildly in her chest. She tried to shake the fear, but it was no use. She'd watched enough horror movies to know that a woman going down to the basement by herself in the dark was a recipe for certain brutal death. She found the breaker box and opened it, then flipped the 2 switches marked with Scotch tape, septic, electric, the handwriting scrawled in Sharpie. The cabin hummed to life. She flipped the light switch on the wall, still nothing. Some bulbs would need to be changed, but she wouldn't worry about that yet. For now, she sprinted back to the stairs and then up them, slamming the basement door behind her. She locked it, leaned against it, her pulse beating hard in her throat. She flipped a switch on the wall and the hallway flooded with light. She exhaled, realized she'd been holding her breath. Everything was fine. She was fine. There was no one here, no monsters, no bears, no bad men lurking in the dark. She walked around the cabin, turning on lights, opening taps, the pipes moaning and sputtering till the rust-colored well water ran clear. A thick layer of dust covered the counters. She surveyed the floor, found piles of dead flies along the baseboards. She cracked open the cabinets, their seals long stuck, found nothing inside but mouse droppings and an ancient box of tea. She plugged in the old yellow refrigerator and it groaned down. She pulled back the curtains and more dead flies fell from their folds. She opened the patio door and stepped out onto the porch, the light of the cabin burning behind her. She looked up at the sky through the circle of trees, a spray of stars unlike anything she could see in the city. She listened to the crickets and peepers and frogs. Somewhere, not far away, the yip of a coyote, then a collective howl from its pack, a circle of hunters in the distance, echoing in the night. There were no monsters here, only the woods and whatever lived within them. It was just her and the wilderness, deep and dark. So I have like other sections that I could read from, but I thought maybe we would like start talking, and then if we feel like more reading later, we could do that. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
We'll just roll.
I mean, it's up to you.
Yeah, okay. See how we feel.
Great. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
So nice to hear you read it. And I mean, I love this novel, and I'm so happy to see all of you here to celebrate Melissa, celebrate this book. I devoured it like a few months ago, and can you all hear me okay? Okay. So, I mean, what you just read, but like the sense of place, the vivid sense of place, rural place, which you know I love in fiction, rural place, trees, a queer, genderqueer protagonist, a talking deer. I mean, what is not to love? I feel like this book was written for me. But I came to your work, as many of us did, through your essays in beautiful Tomboyland, which we were both living in Ohio at the time, and I had read the book, and it had like a profound effect on me, the way you write about gender, masculinity, bodies, queerness, place, home, the Midwest. So I wrote Melissa, and then we ended up meeting, and then we both realized we both had interviews in North Carolina.
At the same time.
Yeah, now we're here. So maybe, you know, that the themes that come up in your book of essays, of course, come up in this novel too. And can you talk about like making that shift from writing personal essays to writing a novel, like the challenges, the delights, how that sort of happened for you, and maybe even anything that's different about the writing process?
Yeah, totally. Also, just like a shout out to Carter's work if you haven't read The Prettiest Star. Also, just a gorgeous, gorgeous book. And especially if you're into rural place, queerness, Carter's got you covered. Yeah, so as I kind of alluded to, I didn't plan so much to write a novel as much as this novel sort of came out of me. And I really mean that. Like, I was finishing Tomboyland. I was staying alone in a cabin in the Northwoods of Wisconsin. I was alone for 6 weeks. I was super alone. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service. It was really creepy, it turned out, being there alone in this like incredibly remote place for a really long time. And I started to go a little crazy. And I would like write and revise and transcribe interviews all day. And then at night, I would like sit on the porch and drink a beer and read mostly horror novels, which is a thing that I do to myself that I don't understand. And like this deer showed up at the edge of the woods, and I was feeding the deer. This is my family's cabin. We feed the deer there, which is not a good thing, actually. You're not supposed to do it. We do it anyway. That theme comes up in the book, which is about enabling. And I started like having conversations in my head with this deer, and suddenly this idea for this book was born. And I started writing at night when I wasn't working on Tomboyland, and I thought I was just writing another essay about the experience of living in the woods and having this strange experience. And I did write an essay about that, but it sort of, this idea started growing and taking shape, and I just kind of followed the idea, and suddenly, I think, a few months later, I had a draft. Several months later, I think. It took a while. But I didn't like have any plans to publish a novel at that point. I was just having fun. And I realized at a certain point that I was writing fiction, and in fiction, there was such liberation because I had been writing these deeply personal essays where I was like putting myself on the page in this very vulnerable way. And this book has a lot of me in it, but as I wrote, these characters started taking shape, and the story and this world started taking shape, and this wholly kind of fictional story emerged. And I just followed it and found myself really enjoying the process of like making things up. And sometimes in my essaying, I find myself like going off into these imaginative spaces, and then with the essay, what you have to do is you have to reel yourself back in to the truth. And sometimes you're allowed to go into the imaginative spaces, which my students who are in the room know we can do and we love doing. But you always have to come back to the truth of what happened and like the facts. And in fiction, I suddenly didn't have to do that. And I found that just extraordinary and so fun. So I kept going. And then at a certain point, I like sent it to my agent, and I was like, is this a thing, or should I just not, I would never show this to anybody because maybe this is stupid. And she was like, this is a thing. But in terms of like the craft of writing fiction, I will say that what I think I love most of all is writing dialogue. And I do some dialogue in nonfiction when I'm kind of working interviews and other people's stories into my work, but this is different, and I found that dialogue was a way for me to get to know my characters and their motivations and their sort of what they were seeking and what they were running from, and their interactions with this place. And especially with the deer, I really loved writing the conversations with the deer.
The dialogue's great. And yeah, I mean, fiction gives you a little bit, even if you're writing something personal, it gives you a little more cover, right? But there's still that, Dorothy Allison, it's a paraphrase, but says something like, in fiction, you still you need to confront your life in your fiction. Yeah.
I definitely did a lot of that.
Yes. Speaking of sort of hiding or cover, I mean, one thing that I love the way you write about kind of like liminal spaces. And so with this novel, I'm thinking of like the woods, right? This beautiful but eerie, possibly dangerous space. The town, which is sort of crumbling as well. She's in these sort of like dream states often, sort of like dream states or hallucinations or like blackouts. And then like space even between like the past and if her mother, like I don't want to get too much away, but what happened with her mother, kind of ghosts around. And then like Sam, who's such a complicated character, and like how she moves through the world, you know, as you wrote, she wasn't easily decipherable, and she was okay with that. You know, the way she moves through the world is this masculine person, genderqueer, intersexuality, and then the possible transformation between human and creature. So there's just like, it's fantastic. There's so much of that in the book. And I don't know, I just want to hear you talk a little bit about your kind of interest in writing about the between spaces or the edges of things or the pockets, you know, in physical space, but also gender, bodies.
Yeah, that's like the space that I think that I am constantly inhabiting in the world, just in general, and in my writing especially. For those of you who have read Tomboyland, you probably are familiar with that. That's like what that book is all about. It's kind of living in this in-betweenness, both in terms of place and body. And I think that I'm always returning to these intersections between body and like and land and home and, you know, where we come from and where we end up, and carving out these places for ourselves that aren't necessarily easily definable, and that kind of murky, indecipherable space between, you know, whether that means between like between one place and another, between one gender and another, one sexuality and another, past and present. In this book, it moves a lot through time, back and forth in time. In that way that is supposed to be kind of like disorienting and a little murky. And I saw Sam as this sort of interesting opportunity to write about that in-betweenness, that liminal quality in a new way, because I love horror. I love stories of the monstrous and transformation stories in particular, like the werewolf story. Also, FYI, Carter has a trans werewolf story that you have to read. It's in Joyland. It's incredible. So I love a werewolf story.
I love a werewolf story.
It's so good. It's just such a good metaphor. And I'm just fascinated by the idea of the monstrous, and in particular the intersections of the monstrous and queerness, and how queer people are so often considered monstrous and called monstrous, and how like there's a line in the book about like when you hear stories about yourself for long enough, early enough and for long enough, you start to believe them, and this kind of like internalization of otherness and monstrousness. And so that's where I wanted Sam to live, like in this, she's turning into something and we don't know what. And there's a lot of suggestion that she might be turning into something, some kind of creature, some sort of woodland creature, whether it's a predator or prey, we don't know. But there's also this gender transformation that's happening too, and she exists in this liminal space, and there's this idea that she's been running from selfhood wherever she's gone, and maybe in this place that is kind of home and not home, she's returning to or becoming a shape that's more true, whatever that shape might be.
Yeah, and real and unreal.
Yeah.
What is real? What is unreal? The murky space between. I also love that it's like she's in a way she's sort of running from her life and in the city. She's coming back, which I think is like a really interesting thing. And I mean that I also write about and I love to sort of talk about is like queers coming from rural spaces or small towns and needing to leave to survive, right? But often feeling this pull, unexplicable, unexplainable, like pull back to that place.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that like my first book was so much about growing up in Wisconsin and leaving Wisconsin, and sort of like this feeling of homesickness and longing for this place. And in this book is sort of this idea of returning and a person returning home. And it came from that experience of me returning to this part of Wisconsin that I knew pretty intimately and loved. Having been living in New York City for over a decade at that point, I think, and like how I had changed and how I had become more of myself in the city. And I was really interested in this idea of like visibility, which I also wrote about in my first book, like the ways one wants to be seen and the ways one does not want to be seen, and feeling very seen in kind of a bad way when you go back to these like rural places that you come from, being more visible, as opposed to being able to like blend in when you're in a city and just sort of disappear. There's that Virginia Woolf essay about like disappearing into a London night where nobody perceives you, and that, you know, so yeah.
Yeah, the protection of the anonymity of a city is sort of gone.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's also this really interesting, it comes up in a book that I love, it's sort of like, it's like she's an outsider, but she's also from this place. And so there's this like code switching that happens where she can like, even like the way she's speaking, she can kind of get back to that vernacular and like language.
It's slippery. And I experience that when I go back home, you know, especially when I was living in New York for a long time, and then I would return back to Wisconsin, and I don't really have much of that, like the Wisconsin accent, although sometimes people will tell me I do, and it comes out. It definitely comes out when I go back, and I just said, did you hear it? Go back. Go back. But there is that sort of like downshifting into a language or a vernacular in a place to try to fit in a little better, and she experiences that in the same way that I do, especially in more rural places like the setting of this book.
Yeah, it's just so well done, the way you kind of like write about that, the feeling of that and the complexity of it. I have another question I want to get to, but if you want to read, or do you want me to?
How are we doing on time? What time I can't read that.
6:36.
Okay. Should I read a short section involving a talking deer?
And ask maybe one quick question, and then
one quick question, and then we'll open it back. Okay. I've had several actual requests for a section of the talking deer, so I wasn't planning on doing this, but I'm going to. So I guess you do need a little context here. So Sam's alone at this cabin. Her mother disappeared years before. She never returned. Sam was sober when she arrived at the cabin. She has relapsed. She has begun drinking again. And there's this doe that's showing up, and mostly the doe is just kind of talking shit. And she's really shit talking. And Sam's like having issues with this deer. Okay. This is definitely the first time I have read this, so, okay. You're doing it wrong, the doe said. Sam was working in the south flower bed in the front of the cabin. She dug up more ditch irises and was pressing them into the soil. She stopped and turned, and there was the doe, standing at the feeder. The animal worked her mouth in that slow circular rhythm, like a cow grinding its cud. She looked at Sam while she chewed. What? Sam asked, annoyed more at herself for responding than by the doe's tone, which she found to be more than a little condescending. She was hungover and tired and didn't have time for the doe's shit today. The irises, the doe said, corn tumbling from her mouth. Don't talk with your mouth full, Sam snapped. If the doe had eyebrows, she might have raised one. But she closed her mouth and kept chewing big, exaggerated chews, then swallowed big, too, making a whole show of it. Sam rolled her eyes. As I was saying, the doe said, the roots should be shallow. You see how they run perpendicular to the plant? They need to be just below the surface so the sun can get them. Sam inspected her work, pawed gently at the dirt where she'd buried the irises, then looked back at the doe. How do you know so much about plants? She asked, pulling off her gloves. She sat in a squat and her quads were burning, but she didn't stand up. She didn't want to spook the doe. She looked at the creature curiously then, her irritation turning to something softer. I studied botany, the doe said with a wink. Did you just wink at me? Can you even wink? The doe didn't respond, only lowered her head back into the trough. Her comic timing was perfect. You're funny, Sam said. Tip your waitress, the doe mumbled through a mouthful of corn. Then she grinned maniacally, kernels spilling everywhere. Sam appreciated her commitment to the bit. She shook her head and looked back at the irises. They did look kind of deep. She remembered her mother telling her something about roots like these, that it was best they were buried shallow, so the sun could soak through the soil. Sam's mother had loved irises, and they had planted the wild ones together one summer when Sam was young, digging them up from the roadside early one morning, working quickly and giggling and swatting at mosquitoes like thieves. Her mother had loved to plant things like her mother before her. Back at home, she'd had a garden, grew flowers and vegetables, and they'd planted and weeded together, their skin freckled from the sun. When Sam left home, her mother stopped planting much, let the garden turn to weed. Gloves off, she dug her fingers back in the earth, gently pushing up the plants by the roots and packing them in again, loosely, a little higher up the soil. Better, the doe said. How can you even see this far? Sam asked. The trough was at least 30 feet away. Good eyes, the doe said. Could have fooled me, Sam said. How come you and your people are always diving into the road in the dark then, just as cars are passing? It's genetic, the doe said. We come from a long line of folks killed by pickup trucks and SUVs, increasingly some hybrids. You might call it generational trauma. Some might say we head toward those lights like it's fate, some kind of collective destiny, following in the footsteps of our forebears. But our vision is solid. Huh, Sam said absently, and continued to press her fingers in the soil. And we're not people, the doe said. What? Sam stopped digging, looked up at the doe. You called us people, but we're not like you. We might jump in front of cars, but your kind destroys itself in a whole different way. Right, Sam said. You destroy everything you touch, too, the doe said, her voice having lost its humor, including us. The doe looked out into the forest and Sam followed her gaze. It was dense and dark and old as far as Sam was concerned, but it was mostly new growth, a product of the logging industry at the turn of the century, all the lumberjacks that worked up here. Right again, Sam said. Those will bloom next month, the doe said, nodding toward the irises. Then she turned back toward the woods, whatever strange universe she came from. Wait, really? Sam asked as the doe walked away. I figured it would be a year. Sam never had much luck growing anything. Her mother and grandmother had taught her some things, but she never quite developed the knack. She always ended up killing the herbs and tomato plants she attempted to grow on her fire escape. She had even killed some succulents, which she was told was nearly impossible. Growing things and keeping them alive was one thing she hadn't inherited. The leaves of the irises were pert and green, and Sam wondered whether their flowers would be purple or white, if they ever bloomed at all. You'll see, the doe said, not looking back. And then she trotted away on spindly legs, disappearing into the woods without a sound.
So glad you read that. Did you have fun writing those?
So much fun. So much fun. I would have written this entire novel as a dialogue between this person and this doe, but I was told that that was probably not a great idea.
I think you had fun writing them. They also add this kind of like comic,
Yeah,
moments in a book that's really dark.
it's pretty dark. Yeah, we need those moments of levity, I think.
And I think this kind of segues into my question, which is around, which is that this is also a novel about addiction, alcoholism, about growing up with the trauma of growing up with an alcoholic parent, her mother, her grandmother. So it's also this generational alcoholism. And so I was really interested in the way you wrote about this, and we talked about this briefly, but it's like we see Sam making these mistakes or bad choices over and over again. She's such a complicated character. And but I also felt like I really felt the desire for the alcohol and also how it made her feel good. I mean, you say it always felt like waking up. but it's almost like she's sort of falling for this really beautiful, charming, toxic person.
Yes.
And so it's kind of like this demon lover femme fatale, right? And I don't know, could you talk about like sort of the decisions or choices you made about writing about alcoholism, the challenges of it? I'm thinking like a character who can't stop drinking, but also who's like drunk for much of the novel. Yeah. Which is difficult to do, like on the page.
Yeah, that was tough, and I was really interested in, again, the kind of like liminal space of being intoxicated. Like, this is not reality, as much, but it's also, things are also happening, and I wanted there to be this uncertainty around what was real and what was imagined, what was Sam in an intoxicated state versus like something terrible is actually happening in the woods or around her. It was important to me to write about struggling with addiction in this way that was like, alcohol in and of itself is not all bad, that it is like, like part of the reason that people drink is because it feels good, and I wanted to kind of write that, like that ecstatic or euphoric feeling, and access that on like a bodily level. And so it became, as I was writing it became this kind of like love, like it was like, I wrote it as Sam's great love. Like, this is the thing that she loves most of all, and that she knows she has to leave and she can't, or she's trying to, and is struggling. So that Carter described it to me earlier as like this like femme fatale, and I was like, oh, that's so it, this lover that just keeps coming back and you keep letting it in, and she shows up at your doorstep in the rain and she's like, let me inside,
You can't walk away.
Femme fatale versus like also vampire. Yeah. Yeah. So it was tough to write. It was also kind of cathartic to write. And addiction was one of those things that I felt like I couldn't write about when I was writing Tomboyland. I couldn't write about it as truly as I wanted to. I was afraid of it. And writing it as fiction allowed me, I think, to access some truths that I couldn't necessarily access when I was writing nonfiction.
That's interesting, yeah, because it does come up in Tomboyland, and I think you do in this novel and then nonfiction too get a sense of like, it's not just, I mean, this is happening throughout the town. It's also part of the region, the setting. It's very sort of accepted. Nobody's talking about it ever in the family.
Yeah, silence, and Wisconsin is the drunkest state in the union. It is a place where, as I write in the book, you can rack up like 4 to 5 DUIs without losing your license. Like it's a place where alcohol is like woven into the fabric of people's being. So I wanted to write that like cultural relationship to alcohol and how that makes it so much harder to leave.
Well, I do want to leave time for all of you, so if you have questions for Melissa.
Yes, Mary.
So when you were reading the first chapter, especially when Sam was entering into the very neglected home, I felt very icked out. But I also will get icked out over anything.
Yeah. I appreciate you listening and not leaving the room.
And it sort of reminded me of in Severance by Ling Ma, when the characters are doing their sort of exploration of these neglected homes and trying to see if, like, is this a place that I can inhabit while I'm getting away from the virus? But I was very drawn to the grotesqueness, and I wondered, is that going to be a recurring theme throughout the, okay.
Yes.
I'll
I'll tell you without giving anything away that there's a lot of rot in this narrative, and especially around the cabin. The cabin is not just deteriorating, but is kind of rotting from the inside. So there's a lot of the grotesque in the structure itself, this kind of rotting place. But certainly also in other ways. I hope you can stomach it.
I think
it's not gory or anything for the most part. So,
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Hi. As someone who's also from Wisconsin, I have found that there's a lot of really great Southern Gothic novels, but until I read your book, I haven't really found anything that really captured like the Gothic Midwestern, like especially, and I'm from Wisconsin, so I'm biased, but that captured like the Wisconsin Gothic, and I always thought that that would make a really incredible book. And I wondered kind of if you discovered any other books that are like similar to that, and kind of what led you to that place.
Great question. I really had this like, I don't know if I had it in my head the whole time, but I think it was at least in the back of my mind, this idea of writing a Midwestern Gothic. That's what I wanted to write. And that idea has been in my mind for a really long time, since I stumbled upon an old and now defunct literary magazine called Midwestern Gothic. And it was excellent. And I found it at an AWP a million years ago and was like, someday I'll publish in here. And I did. And it was an essay that was in Tomboyland that I never would have identified as being Gothic in any way. It was Driftless. I don't know if anyone has read that. It's this very kind of like landscape-based essay, but it's also about like darkness and harshness and like the hardness of the land in the Midwest and Wisconsin in particular. And so I started thinking about like what a Midwestern Gothic would look like beyond, including sort of horror tropes and supernatural stuff, but beyond that. So what the land, how the land might be Gothic, how the people might be Gothic, how these deteriorating places like the cabin rotting and these towns that the town in this book has like taken a really bad hit after the recession. It used to be a kind of like vacation town, and now it's really struggling, and all these storefronts are boarded up and people have lost their jobs, and that is like very common in this part of the state. So that being part of this sort of culture, Gothic, very, to me, like Northwoods Gothic. So that's kind of what I was trying for, and in part because there isn't a lot of it. I don't know.
No, I've looked.
Yeah, but I think when you kind of like expand beyond the idea of the Gothic as horror, you know, and think about the Gothic in these other sort of ways of deterioration and struggle and difficulty and hardness, I would say like one author that I come back to again and again is Louise Erdrich. Like I feel like she writes a Midwestern Gothic, and in particular a native Midwestern Gothic, in this like really powerful way. Her characters are like often battling addiction, and there are ghosts, but people are haunted by their own pasts. So I feel like she's kind of like the North Star. Other questions? Rachel?
This is a return to the point about moving between nonfiction and fiction, and about sort of what's deliberate, what's submission, what's imperative. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the matter of guilt. I'll just stop talking.
No.
of guilt, and about, you know, and sort of, I'm going to say I think sometimes, you know, we choose the genre or we choose the construct. And sometimes the construct or the genre reveals itself as the writing is happening, is coming out. And it's all occurring in the context of what we have lived and what we've imagined and what we've imagined might have happened instead of what did happen. And I haven't read this yet, but I understand from pieces of it that some of it has been imagined and some of it has been lived, and that there are other people back in Wisconsin, back in Greenpoint, maybe move to Chapel Hill with you. And I think, guilt, and I think perception also, to use another word that you used earlier. Like how do you operate from a place of writerly freedom, while also, I think, I'm wondering, maybe existing with guilt in the context of your life outside of the page.
Yeah. Wow. How long do we have? We did our nonfiction MFA together, so
And a little bit of fiction work.
a little bit of fiction work too. Yes. Okay. Whew, this is a big question. I think, yeah. Another thing that is liberating about fiction is that I get to say it's fiction, and even when it is less fictional, in the parts that are less fictional than others, I get to say this came, this is imaginary, or this is fictional, and that gives me a little bit of freedom from what sort of like fear. It's like, for me as a writer, it's way more about fear than guilt usually, like fear of how people are going to respond to my work, how it's going to hurt them, how it might harm them. I really try to keep that in mind as I write anything and try to avoid harming anyone at all costs. What was interesting about this book is that I feel, like I was saying before, about it kind of allowing me to access certain truths in a way that I wasn't able to access in my first book of essays. I felt like I was getting at some stuff in my own personal history and in my family history that had never been talked about because of the silence that sort of defines where I came from and the kind of family I grew up in. No one talks about anything. And I sort of said some things aloud, and that was super terrifying. My students often ask me about this, like, what do you do when you're going to show your work to your family or your parents? And it never stops being terrifying, is the truth. Like, it never stops being terrifying to me. But somehow in doing this, I felt like I was kind of opening up a conversation that maybe hadn't ever been had. And the people who I was most afraid of reading it have read it already, and I think that, like, they were not mad, they were not upset, and I had all these fears about how people would respond, and I don't know. I think there's some relief in some ways, even if it remains unspoken, that some of these kind of like things have been said, like the pressure valve has been released a little bit. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I don't know.
Keep talking.
Okay, cool. Where are we at on time? Do we have time for one more? I don't know what time it is.
6:56.
Oh yeah, we got one more. One more. Two more? Yeah, hey.
Hey.
What's up?
Well, I'm gonna be that guy that says this is more of a statement than a question.
Great. We need one. We always need one.
But Sam has a lot of these kind of obliterative moments throughout the novel, and I found that I sat down at the coffee shop at 8 o'clock, and then I had this blackout. Next thing I know, I'm 150 pages deep.
Oh yeah.
So just like the propulsiveness of the writing was wonderful, and you just kind of get in that trance, and it's kind of enacting in a lot of ways what Sam's going through. But I find that it's presented in the novel with addiction. It's also layered over top of transformation, and it can also be this obliterative, transformative moment. Cathartic can be positive, and you can bloom, of course, into another person. And there's certain moments where that's just as apparent as the rot that's happening in these kind of blackout moments. And I'm just curious, that this was my experience kind of reading the novel, if there's any piece of fiction, or I was kind of wondering, this might be too teen beat, but like my question is kind of like, what would be your soundtrack, to the novel? Because I was getting like an early 90s alternative vibe going on when I was reading it. And I was just thinking, beyond literature itself, what were some kind of other things you were tuning into when you were working on this? Or...
Great question. Do you know the website Large Hearted Boy?
What is it?
Large Hearted Boy.
No.
They do soundtracks to books. I got to do one for my first book, and it was so fun. This is such a good question. First of all, awesome that you had that experience. I love that. And I just I love what you said about the sort of obliterative state. Oblivion is a big part of this book, and I like this idea of it being sort of like it's not always negative, oblivion. But soundtrack. Okay, so feel like in the 5-ish years it took me to, as I was working on this book, Soup to Nuts, I was returning to a lot of my 90s alt rock pop roots. When I first came down to North Carolina in 2020-21 as the Keenan visiting writer, I was driving my father's Chevy Trailblazer. They sold to me for $1 and it had a 6-disc changer in it. And John, my partner, sent me Everclear's So Much for the Afterglow. And I have this like memory, the sense memory in my head of driving through Chapel Hill, which was empty because no one was here because it was like peak COVID, with the windows down, listening to So Much for the Afterglow. Feeling really cool. So I was listening to that, and I was listening to Third Eye Blind's debut record, which, best ever. Counting Crows, which I'm writing an essay about right now. So there was a lot of that, and I think like part of that was because I was listening to that when I lived in Wisconsin, and I was trying to access that kind of these adolescent memories of my life there as I was writing Sam's Past. But beyond the sort of like 90s soundtrack, I would say that I was also going through a big Waxahachie phase and a Big Thief phase. I'm always in a Big Thief phase. Frightened Rabbit. Frightened Rabbit was huge for this book. Actually, does anyone know Frightened Rabbit? Oh my God. Oh my God. Go home and listen now. Right now. You can leave. They're a really excellent band. I love them very, very, very deeply. Their songwriter and frontman sadly died by suicide. He struggled with addiction. And so there's an epigraph from one of his songs, and it was on the last record he made. It's from a song, I Wish I Was Sober. Their work is super important to me and was very important to me as I was writing this book. I would listen to it, I would play it on guitar when I was trying to like think about this like desire to be sober and struggling with addiction. So it was a big part of my soundtrack.
I think that's all the time we have.
All right. Thank you all.